I think maybe this is a naive question, but if you think back, like Lewis Mumford writing on the history of cities, and we were brought up with some sense of why we have cities, port towns and crossroads, etc. And today, if you ask somebody why is all this urbanization, well, that's where the jobs are. But I guess I'm asking about kind of what you ended with, happiness, well-being. If energy was clean and it wasn't an issue of using energy more efficiently because of being in the city, if you take, let's say, a middle-income person or a high-income person or a low-income person, and you move them from exurban or rural into a city, and you did surveys of happiness horizontally, would you find an increase? So that's kind of a quality question, but the fundamental question is, why do we have cities in the 21st century?
Okay.
So I'm not going to touch the happiness question, except, I can speculate on that, but I don't bring much to the table. I don't think we understand happiness very well. We can study other aspects of well-being that are easy. Happiness is very elusive, even though people are trying to measure it, but it's a pretty difficult thing to measure. But well-being, the cities of the 20th century, especially the early 20th century and the late 19th century, where well-being was not better off in cities. Today, well-being is better off in cities, and that remains by and large true, except for the poorest people in cities, and it's actually very hard to quantify sometimes. But so you can have, so the heterogeneity in cities of some aspects of well-being is much greater than, probably much greater than we've had in the past, because they're very high-end and very low-end. So as I said, we don't really know the extent to which the poor are growing in cities. They're growing, that's for sure. But why do people live in cities today? Well, there's a lot of momentum behind city growth. That's the first thing. The second thing, the jobs are in the cities. And they will continue to be in the cities. And thirdly, there are economies of scale in cities. And I actually think the climate community should, it's not, when I hear, very often, like when Brian O'Neill's slides were up showing that urbanization impacts emissions in a negative way. So we have greater emissions from urbanization. People say, well, we shouldn't live in cities. Well, if our alternative model or counterfactual of the world were non-urban, and it was evenly distributed pockets of people using energy and other resources that contribute to climate change, it would be there would be far greater gains to scale. So we would have greater emissions. So cities have economies of scale that are really well oiled and well functioning. And so I think that's why, and there are a lot of benefits to living in cities. There are some negative things to living in cities, and particularly the cities of the developing world that have a lot of air pollution now that look like our early, the cities, of 100 years ago in the developed world. So I think that's because we have, and because the incentives continue to be in cities.
Why cities exist, real quick.
Yes.
Real quick, the question's a good one. People live in cities for reasons. I think in many cases, it's not so much the positives associated with cities as because the negatives people see if they're not in cities. Declining jobs, declining opportunities, declining things to do in your spare time, younger age cohorts who want to go to the cities because they're more exciting. And so I think one of the issues is what to do about the areas that are not cities, to make those areas more attractive as places to live. And Bill, under his REAP name, did an atlas of the American West, which showed that many small communities in the West are increasingly attractive to people who have money, who can do their work through information technology. And so there are some moves in the opposite direction that benefit the wealthy but not the poor.
Wait, can I?
No.
I want to add.
Well,
You can.
Here.
We need to let the others speak
Right,
too.
go ahead.
Just building on what they said, because we don't understand that there are different dimensions of urbanization we need to include, is that we are struggling with this. Cities are attractive because they are centers of investments and employments. They are attractive because they are centers of power, of cultural innovation, of educational places. They are also attractive because of economies of scales and because they concentrate infrastructures and goods. And of course, that comes at a price, particularly when cities are growing. So there are many dimensions we are posed to include in our analysis of why cities grow and what this means for adaptation and mitigation, or for energy and water use and other dimensions of change, of environmental change.
Kathy.
So,
And then
so
I've
it
got
ties
Anita.
back to my talk that I didn't get to really elaborate too much on, and that is the importance of scale. Deborah, you mentioned it, and Tom, and Patty, you talked about how there's a variability between what's happening in your backyard and then the economies of scale as what's really controlling what's happening in your backyard, your city, your county, your region, et cetera. I just kind of wanted to point out, I think it's really encouraging to see the development of the communication between engineers, social and natural scientists, particularly with regard to this system. And as Deborah pointed out, in India, there are 3 major cities that are developing on coastal areas. That's an opportunity really, as well as the inland areas, to think about how to bring in the natural scientists with regards to coastal resilience. My point and my question is, I'm actually personally getting more involved with this topic. I was fortunate to give a talk to the Puget Sound Regional Council a few weeks ago, which is a consortium of 4 of the largest counties in the Seattle area. Seattle itself is about 650,000. The greater area is over 1 million. And they actually have a modeling framework that looks at transportation and parcel-based land use planning going out to 2040. They do not account for energy requirement, which is why I was here to talk about the energy land water nexus. The
Question?
Yeah, I'm leading to that. So my question is, with a lot of areas in the world, and in particular another group I'm getting involved with is 100 Resilient Cities. Have you heard of that? So they've identified 32 cities in the world. Many are in Latin America, Africa, and the developed world. I encourage you to work with these groups, and are you thinking about the regional consortia like Puget Sound? Boulder is one of the 100 Resilient Cities. And they're starting to start up. So I would really want to think about bringing in these urban planners and these developing areas into the academic picture as well, because that's where you're going to get the real picture about every city is going to have a different reason for why it's growing and why its peri-urban systems are around that.
Thanks. Well, thanks, Kathy. Responses to Kathy's comments.
In fact, there are a lot of groups who support what you say, and they're increasing access to funding to help make that happen. The Clinton Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, START. I think if we reach out, we'll find some opportunities for that we're not aware of right now.
And there's a lot of opportunity to bring the natural, the social, and the engineered knowledge with what these groups are already trying to plan for their futures.
I agree. Having these collaborative groups at the scale of particular cities is necessary. New York City has such a group, and I'm in conversation with them. But I would also argue that we cannot learn enough from looking at a single city at a time. It may be we need to do that, but we also need to pull them all together and harness, like, the scale question is partly being able to do things at a single city and a sub-city scale, but another scale issue is being able to draw strength from what you don't know. And the way we collect data now and the way we will continue to collect data for a long time will not allow us to take one city at a time and generalize. And there are some themes across cities. So I think that we need to treat that cities as systems and understand them better. And particularly this notion of cities growing on their the peri-urban development. There's a lot of common patterns in peri-urban development across place. And this gets a little bit back to John's question, which is like, do we need cities? But I think the question is really, what are cities really? Is not, because rural areas nowadays can, electrify themselves with standalone solar panels, rural electrification systems with low carbon imprint. And those rural areas now have amenities that are much more like last century's urban areas. And a lot of our peri-urban areas have a lot of peri-urban agriculture. And so there's a lot of blurring of these lines. But to the extent that when you study a particular place, it's really integrated and you have land use and so forth, we can understand that a lot better.
Patty?
We're already working with those, thank you, with CD.
Okay, so let me we've got about 10 more minutes, and I've got Anik and then Marty and Sherilyn and Jerry. And that might be about if we get that done. And I'll ask that we get efficient questions and efficient answers. And those are the ways I saw the names. I hope that. Anik.
Yes, I actually had two questions, one to Tom and one to Patty. Tom, I was just reflecting on that you've been working in this field for half a century, and so really have a good sense, or almost our personal archive of how this change in the field, but also you've witnessed really the larger cultural changes taking place. So I think this has been a period of dramatic cultural change, democratization, individualization, emancipation of so many groups, like including women, but also radical change of values and what I would call worldviews. How do you see all of that interact with what you called the ways we view the systems we care about? Can you say a little bit more about that?
So, can I hold you just to one question, Anik?
Oh, sure.
I think we're more open to crossing boundaries in the way we think about these things than we were 20 years ago, and we were more open 20 years ago than we were 40 years ago. I've heard at this, under the tent this week, all kinds of people who were narrower in their thinking 10 or 20 years ago than they are now. And I think that is a very encouraging sign that we're going to make progress with what you're talking about.
That may also relate to urbanization.
Yeah, another comment from other?
No,
okay.
let's be fast.
All right, and then we've got
Inefficient.
Marty, Sherilyn, Jerry, and if we can. Marty,
Okay.
yeah.
I want to focus on one thing, which is equity, which you brought up. I think you made the comment that the problem is not population, but there is a problem in the distribution of wealth. And I think we're all thinking about this with Piketty's book showing that dip that took place with more equitable distribution of income in the United States and other developed countries. I wonder what you think of the idea, and whether it's quantifiable, that because of globalization, developed countries are becoming more like developing countries, and developing countries are becoming more like developed countries in terms of the distribution of wealth. In other words, that we're developing sort of elite classes who understand technology, who understand the STEM topics, science and technology and so forth, and other people who don't. And that the people who do, regardless of where they are going to become successful. And this is because of globalization, because you're not competing with somebody down the road, you're competing with somebody in Pakistan or Bangladesh. And educationally, you can go online and you can take an MIT course for free, no matter where you are in the world. So in one way, you could say that's a great thing because it's democratizing the world and turning us into a meritocracy, if that even makes any sense. I just want your thoughts on it. I'm going to shut up.
All right.
So I think it's very plausible that that's happening. We haven't tested that hypothesis. I haven't tested it. I don't think it has. It's a little hard to test because of the way data are collected. But I think it is and will be assessed at some point by probably by economists, and that's just fine. I think it is. I think, and there are lots of examples that, like, Karnataka is the neighbor of. I mean, like, Bangalore and Atlanta are more like neighbors to one another than, for example, Bangalore is to another Indian city or something like that. So I think that. And what values you put on the outcome of that, but I do think we might see a redistribution of of global inequality. We might see it change because of some issues of globalization. That does not still address, and I suspect strongly that current technology will foster democratization, which will lead to some of these other better governance structures. But that's not a fast-moving horse as well. And I think that but some of the issues of inequality will be exacerbated before they are diminished, and that will also and the general historic inequality doesn't go away if we don't do anything either. So I think that does require some explicit action. The current conditions that we find ourselves in terms of emissions reduction now are the result of consumption that happened last century, and the consequences of it will be borne by cities in the developing world largely that they themselves didn't produce. And I don't think we have a structure to address that problem.
I will say that there is evidence, there is empirical evidence that both in developing countries and in developed countries, inequality has increased. There is this beautiful work by this economist, right? I bought the book. I'm still to read it. Yes, and there is evidence that inequality has increased, meaning you have these islands of wealth in developing and developed countries. But we need to
whether
pay
it's
attention.
globalization that's the
Yes.
cause is really not.
What
that's
we need
not
to
clear.
pay attention to is the fact that we are adding two big animals to the global constellation, which are China and India. And the middle classes, just the sheer amount of middle classes we have in those two countries, is making a huge difference globally. Yeah, as it is the amount of poor populations these countries have, and the local level impacts of also their poverty. The global level impacts of wealth in developing countries is something that we need to also evaluate. A second point I want to make is that, and this is a study we did with data on Latin America, is that there's a lot of complacency, you use that word, among wealthy populations by thinking, wow, it will be okay for me. I can go to those forested areas, get my house there. I can go to those flood risk areas. And we sometimes forget that we are also at risk. So, I mean, I think we need to be very careful in the evaluation of the role of the hazard, exposure to hazard, and of capacities and assets when dealing with risk. And we are far away from going there, and I think that's part of the future of our analysis. I mean, I have found for air pollution in Latin America that in terms of exposure, both wealthy and poor districts are equally at risk. And we ran some Poisson regressions, and we were like appalled by our findings. So again, we need to be careful with how things come together in this equation.
I think you're right. The issue in many cases is given a distribution of incomes that shows inequality, are there ladders in a country by which people in the lower socioeconomic groups can move upward or not? We've historically thought that in the United States, in North America and Europe, we have a lot of those ladders where developing countries do not. If you're in a lower group, you're trapped there for life. 10 years or so ago, I rode in from the airport in New Delhi with a Sikh taxi driver who said, I have 5 kids and all 5 of them are in the university. That's a sign that the ladder is being built to create a middle class so that there are routes to improve. In our country, I think we see lots of lower socioeconomic groups who have no such ladders available. In many cases, the key is education, and that's something that's a part of our agenda here.
And speaking of that, Sherilyn.
Yes, thank you. That's a great setup, Tom. You know, having spent the last 6 years in a really edgy urban environment of Atlanta, having spent most of my adult life in Colorado, right? So this has been a really sharp contrast for an individual to experience, and it raises a number of questions. When I stand before an audience of 400 people as an educator and ask who's seen the Milky Way ever in their lives, right? No one raises their hand. No one. And most of those people will never see the Milky Way, okay? So, I mean, that's just an example from an astronomer's point of view, but I've also talked to very erudite urbanites who've lived in the city and come up in the city in Boston, very smart people, highly educated. They really don't understand where food comes from. Right? I mean, they really don't. I mean, it comes from the grocery shelf, and they have a certain attitude about it, and they don't see certain kinds of interconnections that most of us in our educational and communication would find appalling. Right? And I wonder, with that setup, and the stimulation of things like the world views that we heard, and the interiority possibility, I wonder to the extent, yes, education and pushing out information is part of it. I wonder to the extent in the research agendas and the demography, where people are living and what the life circumstances are, the interiority is being explored. Each of you had some dimension of disciplines needing to get together, or there needing to be certain types of research, the qualitative and quantitative combination that's so important. it seems to me that the qualitative could include, does it include, and what's the importance of it including, that exploration of the interiority of people, what their motivations are for doing what they do and being where they are.
Well, I have done some work on that because when we do ground truthing with communities, we explore risk perception and we explore how people go about their daily lives. And I can tell you, I mean, that many of these communities I have worked with have a very good understanding of their environment. They perhaps, meaning they know how to go around, they know what the sources of risk are. They don't use our academic language. But once you move them to, and that happened to us, we invited leaders of our communities to go to a workshop with decision makers. Once you move them there, they just don't open their mouth. And if they do, there is a lot of power relationships going on there. I remember Roger saying that yesterday, right? That we need to see the role of power also locally. So the point I want to make to you is that sometimes we think these people are ignorant, but what happens is that we are not willing to get out of our boxes and understand how they do things and how they perceive things, what words they use to use names. And this brings me to an example of my work with farmers in Mexico when I did my PhD in Germany. I was asking values and perceptions and using this measure of how much they know erosion and other environmental problems. And although the 101 of ethnography tells you don't use your technical jargon, I use in my pilot the word erosion. And I asked my first farmers, do you know what erosion is? The first looked at me like, no. The second was more clever than me and told me, oh yes, when the water is, when the soil is watered down. I cannot translate the word. I said, yes, that's, so the guy knew it. But I came with my jargon to explore his knowledge, not being aware of how they see the word, name the word, and you know, and that is something I really think we are far away from grasping. How do we capture knowledge and perception without without using our jargon, you know, without using this gap between these people and the way they use words and the way we use words.
Real quick, and then we got one more question, and we'll break.
When we think education, we tend to think classrooms. I was in a small town in upland Malaysia about 10 years ago, and there were 3 cyber cafes in that town that were jammed with kids between 15 and 25, and with other people waiting to get to access to a machine. We need to look for ways to use the internet revolution to get information out to people around the world who suddenly have access to information they didn't have before, and to make that opportunity a way to teach, to transfer information to people they can use.
Okay, real quick.
Yeah, they may not know where food comes from, but they probably know how to use public transit. And so, I think, that you have to take.
You know what you need to know.
Yeah. So, and I think all knowledge has to be harnessed. So, I would say there's maybe the differences are greater now, but you have to. Everybody's got a starting point. So.
I'd like to squeeze in our co-chair, Jerry, who was on the list as the last question, and I know we're going right to a break.
Okay, so this kind of starts with something Deborah showed, but all 3 of you may comment on this, but I think when you showed that map of India, and the biggest population, the biggest cities in India are in the most arid places, and this idea that some cities have arisen in the wrong places in terms of resources and climate change, and that this is a connection to the physical climate science between what you as social scientists study in terms of urbanization and what climate science are looking at in terms of aridification, water cycle, water resources, and all that kind of thing. So, this
And
must
it's
be something.
irreversible, she said.
Yeah, and this must be something you
can't
study.
move-
You know, the
you can't
idea
move them around.
some cities are in the wrong places in terms of resources, and what do you do about that?
Yep. Last words.
Okay, so priors, right? So when I started this work, and I didn't show my aridity results, but when I started this work, I said, oh, let's look at seaward hazards, because climate change is all about, you know, sea level rise and increased storm surges and so forth. And indeed, so many of our cities are coastal, so we have to pay attention to it. Well, guess what? We have far more cities in arid zones than we do living in close proximity to the, and exposed to either coastal flooding or inland flooding. Inland flooding is about the same magnitude as coastal flooding. So we have cities, and some of these dryland cities actually face quite a bit of inland flooding risk, because they have flash flooding. They don't have the roots infrastructure, meaning the physical, their ecozone does not accommodate water, you know, like flash floods. And if those are going to increase with climate change, this will be a big problem for those cities.
Is it the same for population, more in arid than coastal?
Yes,
Could-
more
if you could
people.
define those?
Yes, more people live in arid zones than live in coastal. I mean, there's a fairly narrow band of coastal zones in the world. I mean, cities are disproportionately coastal, but nevertheless, more people live in cities in arid zones. So.
Yeah, right.
Yes, so water is
Last words,
right.
Deborah.
Water is a really big issue, and this is a place for a lot of connections. And it's I have to say, I think it's a really, really complicated one. It gets back to this point of bringing in different kinds of agency. I mean, the hydrological modelers don't. Some pay attention to watersheds, some pay attention to other. I mean, they all pay attention to evapotranspiration and so forth. But most of them don't pay attention. I'm sorry, we don't have Michael here. They don't pay attention to water boards, for example. So. And water boards in the developed world or in the U.S. are mostly privatized, but so they're state-run in a lot of places. It's a place where there's connections at like all levels, and I think we're just starting to ask those questions. And there are some communities of people looking at dryland cities, but I do want to say that places that are already dry, and you know, a lot of countries are landlocked, and that's just the result of history. And a lot of those places are the driest, those interior places. So they have both remoteness and dryness, but their existing dryness has made them more efficient. So they will ironically be more prepared to deal with future dryness than the cities that are not, that think of themselves as currently water rich. So that in and of itself is kind of a weird issue to have to think about. So sorry for taking.
Thanks. Let's thank our speakers.